On the evening of January 6, 1872, in the stairwell of the grandest hotel in New York, a man named Edward Stokes raised a small pistol and fired twice into the body of one of the most flamboyant millionaires in America. Jim Fisk fell on the stairs. He was not the only body on the floor. Little more than a year before, a veiled woman in black had crossed the deck of a ferry on San Francisco Bay and shot her lover through the chest as he sat beside his wife and his children. And on a winter morning in a quiet boarding house, a gift wrapped in Tiffany-blue would kill a woman who had done nothing at all, a widow with a headache, poisoned in another man's place. 3 love triangles, 3 bodies on the floor. And every time, the one who did the killing did not hang. Who killed and who walked? Before I take you onto that staircase and onto the deck of that ferry, subscribe and stay with me. If you love the scandals the great families paid to bury, this is your channel. 3 bodies and not 1 rope. Chapter 1. The Killing That Taught America How to Walk Free. In 1859, a congressman shot an unarmed man dead in a public park across from the White House. And in doing so, he handed the century an excuse it would use for decades to come. The congressman was Daniel Sickles, a Tammany Hall Democrat from New York, a man whose own reputation for scandal was already well established when the story began. He had a young wife. Her name was Teresa, born into a musical family of Italian immigrants, granddaughter of the man who wrote the librettos for Mozart. She had married Sickles when she was scarcely more than a girl, and he many years her senior. By the winter of 1859, they lived on Lafayette Square in Washington, in sight of the president's own house, and Teresa had fallen into an affair with the most eligible man in the capital. His name was Philip Barton Key, and his father had written the national anthem. He was the district attorney for the capital, a widower, and reckoned the most eligible man in Washington. The affair had a ritual to it. When Key wanted Teresa, he would come into Lafayette Square below her window and wave a white handkerchief, and she would understand, and she would go to the rented house on 15th Street, where they met. Sickles learned of it the way these things were always learned, by an anonymous letter. This one signed with 3 initials that no one has ever identified. He confronted his wife. She broke and she wept, and he made her sit and write out a confession in her own hand. And its most quoted line has survived 160 years because it is so bare. She wrote that she had done what was usual for a wicked woman to do. 2 days later, Sickles saw Key in the square, waving the handkerchief, calling for a woman who would not be coming down. He walked out with a pistol. What passed between the 2 men is preserved in more than one wording, and the versions differ, but the shape is fixed. Sickles said that Key was a scoundrel who had dishonored his house and that he must die. Key, who was not armed, asked what for. He threw the only thing he had, which by some accounts was a pair of opera glasses, and he cried out not to be killed, and Sickles fired again and again, until the son of the man who wrote the anthem lay dying in the road within sight of the White House. Then Sickles put the gun away and gave himself up, and the country prepared to hang him. It did not hang him. What happened instead is the reason this film exists. He assembled a team of the finest lawyers in America, 8 of them, working without a fee, and among them was Edwin Stanton, who within a few years would be Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War. They did something that had never succeeded in an American courtroom before. They argued that the shock of his wife's betrayal had driven Sickles briefly and completely insane, that for the minutes it took to cross the square and empty a pistol into an unarmed man, he had not been in command of his own mind. It was the first successful temporary insanity defense in the history of the United States, and underneath it ran an older, unwritten thing: the belief that a man who kills the seducer of his wife is beyond the reach of the written law. One of his lawyers told the jury, in a phrase to remember, that they had gathered to fix the price of the marriage bed. The lawyers gave the jury a performance to match the killing. One of them spoke for the better part of a day, quoting scripture and Shakespeare. A former Secretary of the Treasury took the stand to describe the conditions Sickles had been in on the night he learned the truth. A man in an agony of despair, the witness said. The most terrible thing he had ever seen in his life, convulsed and sobbing, and beyond the reach of anyone near him. Edwin Stanton, who within a few years would run the War Department through the bloodiest fighting the country would ever know, told the jurors of a higher law than any written in the statute books, a law set down in the heart of every husband that fixed death as the wage of the man who defiled a marriage. Whatever name the plea carried, it worked as an appeal to the gut, pitched at a room full of married men, and the court helped it work. When the prosecution tried to lay Sickles's own long history with other women before the jury, to show that the avenging husband was himself a practiced adulterer, the judge refused to allow it. So the dead man's morals were opened to the room and picked over, and the living killers were sealed shut, and the asymmetry that would define every trial in this story was written into the rules of the very first one. A wife's betrayal could cost a man his life. A husband's cost him nothing, not even a question. The jury was out a little over an hour. When the word came back, the room erupted in cheers, and Daniel Sickles walked free. He went on to lose a leg at Gettysburg, to win the Medal of Honor, and to live to 94. Teresa did not fare so well. Society had cheered her husband as an avenging hero, right up to the moment he did the one thing it could not forgive. He took her back. The public could stomach a killing. It could not stomach forgiveness. Teresa became an outcast, defended by no one but the man who had shot her lover, and she died of consumption in 1867, about 30 years old. That pattern is the machine, and it is about to run 3 more times. A body on the floor, a killer who does not hang, and a woman consumed by the very story that set the killer free. These are not mysteries of who did it. In every case that follows, the killer is known from the first, down to the hand on the pistol and the poison in the bottle. The only question older and colder than that is the one the whole century kept answering the same way. Which of them, having killed, was ever made to pay? Chapter 2. The Machine That Decided Who Hanged. 3 forces met in Gilded Age America, and together they built a way for the powerful to kill for love and be forgiven. The first was the law that was not written down. Lawyers called it the unwritten law, and it lived only in the sympathy of juries, the shared conviction that a husband, a father, a wronged lover who killed to avenge a betrayal had done something the statutes could punish, but decent men would not. It had no place in any book of law. That was its power. It needed a disguise to walk into a courtroom, a respectable coat to wear in front of a judge, and after 1859, it had one. Temporary insanity. Emotional insanity. The idea that overwhelming passion could seize a mind and darken it, that a person could kill without being answerable for the killing, and then come back to himself and be a citizen again. The medicine of the age was ready to help. Doctors spoke of moral insanity, of a derangement of the feelings that left the intellect untouched, of irresistible impulse, of 100 conditions that gave a jury permission to acquit while pretending to weigh the evidence. The names for it multiplied as the century wore on. Moral insanity, some of the doctors called one version, a rot in the feelings and the affections that left the reason clear, so that a man might know a thing was wrong and still be held excused for doing it. Irresistible impulse, others called another, a passion so total that it swept the will aside. The theories were shaky and much argued over, even among the alienists who advanced them, and their shakiness was exactly their use, because a sickness vague enough could be fitted over almost any killing, and a jury that wished to acquit could always find a doctor willing to help it wish. What the plea offered was permission. It let 12 men feel what they already felt, that a certain kind of killing was no true crime, and then hand that feeling back as a verdict, dressed in the sober language of the clinic. And it was never evenly given. A defense of that kind was assembled out of costly parts, celebrated lawyers, paid physicians, weeks of a court's time, and those parts came only to the man who could pay for them. The unwritten law wore the robes of chivalry, the defense of home and honor, but in practice it was the private property of the wealthy, a mercy that fell most often and most softly on those who least needed mercy of any other kind. The second force was the newspaper. The killing of Philip Barton Key had arrived at the exact moment the telegraph and the cheap press were teaching America to consume a scandal all at once, coast to coast, in a single morning. Teresa's confession was leaked mid-trial and printed everywhere. So scandalous that in California, a paper was prosecuted for obscenity merely for reprinting it. A play about the killing opened in Boston within a week of the verdict. By the 1890s, this appetite had grown into the circulation war between the great New York papers, illustrated, breathless, sold on the front step by the shrieking headline. A society murder was the perfect product, and the press learned to build the very public sympathy that the juries would then reward. The third force was money. An all-star defense, the best medical witnesses money could buy, a courtroom managed like a theatre. These did not come cheap, and they did not come to the poor. The unwritten law in practice was a rich man's law, and its mercy fell most often on those who could afford to summon it. Beneath all three ran something quieter and stranger, the temper of the age itself. This was the era of the séance, of mediums and mourning rituals, and a whole nation trying, after the mass death of the Civil War, to speak across the thin veil to those it had lost. The same public that devoured a murder confession over breakfast would sit that evening in a darkened parlour, holding hands around a table, waiting for a knock from the other side. It is the register these three stories are told in, because the people who lived them believed in curses and in haunted houses, and in minds that came apart, and because the era reached for the language of the uncanny whenever it did not wish to look directly at what it had allowed. Keep an eye on that. Every time one of these stories turns toward the ghostly, ask what plainer thing it is standing in front of. For the women, the stakes were not theatrical at all. A married woman in this country owned little and controlled less. A troublesome wife, a mistress who would not be quiet, a daughter who loved the wrong man, could be managed by money, by lawyers, and, if it came to it, by a doctor's signature and the door of an asylum. The men in these stories reach for pistols and poison. The world reached for the women with something slower. So here is the wager the age had made with itself, without ever saying it aloud. Let a man of the right sort kill for love, and a jury of his peers will call it madness and send him home. The bill will still come. It will simply be handed to someone else. Watch now who receives it. Chapter 3. The showman who bought everything but her love. Jim Fisk ran a railroad out of an opera house, and he could shake the gold of a nation loose from its vault. But the one thing he could not hold was a woman who had stopped loving him. He had come up from nothing, and he never pretended otherwise. He was born on April 1st, 1835, in a small town in Vermont, the son of a travelling peddler, and he left school as a boy to work the wagons. As a young man, he ran off with a circus, and the circus never left him. When he came home, he took his father's peddling route and turned it into a fleet of wagons, painted in bright colours, drawn by matched horses, a parade rolling into every town. He sold dry goods in Boston. Then came the war and the making and losing of fortunes in army contracts, and by the end of the 1860s, he had arrived on Wall Street as the loudest and least respectable operator on it. He made himself notorious in the fight for the Erie Railway, printing stock and buying judges and legislators. And then, in the autumn of 1869, he and his partner Jay Gould tried to corner the entire supply of gold in the country. For a few days in September, the price climbed and climbed as their buying squeezed the market. And men who had sold gold, they did not have watched ruin come up the street toward them. Then the government opened the treasury and sold $4 million in gold, and the price collapsed in minutes, and the day passed into memory as Black Friday. Around $100 million in value was destroyed. Gould, who had quietly been selling while Fisk kept buying, is thought to have come away with 11 or 12 million. And Fisk escaped the wreckage by the simple expedient of repudiating his own contracts, refusing to honour the trades, hiding behind his broker and letting other men carry the loss. It tells almost everything about him. He would take the winnings and disown the debts, and he would do it with a grin. What he did with the money was pure theatre. He and Gould bought the Great Opera House at 23rd Street and 8th Avenue, renamed it the Grand Opera House, and moved the offices of the Erie Railway into the upper floors so that a railroad was run from the rooms above a working stage. He put a safe 7 stories tall inside the building. He controlled a line of steamboats, and on them he hung cages of singing canaries and installed brass bands to play as the paddles turned. He had himself made an honorary colonel of a regiment of the State Guard, and he loved the gilded uniform of it more than any real soldier ever loved a medal. The respectable men of the city loathed him, and the working people of the city adored him, because he gave to the poor with the same showman's flourish that he gave to everything, and the gap between those two feelings would matter enormously on the day he died. He had a wife. He had married Lucy when he was 19, and she was 15, and she lived apart from him up in Boston, in a house he paid for, with a companion of her own, tolerating his life in New York from a distance of 200 miles. It was a marriage kept up on paper and in kindness, long emptied of everything else. And into the space where a wife should have been walked a young woman named Josie Mansfield. She had been born Helen Josephine Mansfield in Boston in December of 1847, and her childhood was its own small tragedy. Her father was a journalist who went west to the goldfields and was murdered there by a business rival when she was about 7. Her biographer records a stepfather who abused and then sold her, a claim that belongs to her biographer and not to any court, though it fits the shape of a girl who arrived in New York at 20, broke with, as one account has it, a single presentable dress to her name. She was, by the measure of her age, a great beauty, dark-haired and full-figured, and when a friend introduced her to Jim Fisk in the autumn of 1867, the richest and gaudiest man in New York decided he must have her. She did not fall into his hands at once. The story that came down has her holding him off for months, refusing the $100 bill he was said to press on the women he fancied, giving way only when an overdue rent and an empty purse left her nothing else to do. Whatever the truth of that courtship, the shape of what came after is plain enough, and it is the shape of a man who had confused a woman with a purchase. Into that hunger walked Jim Fisk, with his cornered gold and his opera house, and his settled conviction that everything in the world answered in the end to money. What he spent on her belongs in a ledger of its own, and the figures come down through her biographer and the papers of the day, so they stand here as the era reported them. He put something like $65,000 of improvements into a brownstone for her, a house set just behind his own opera house. He gave her perhaps $50,000 in cash. He hung $250,000 in emeralds from Tiffany around her throat, and a diamond necklace, and a tiara, and pearls, and 25 rings for her fingers. He kept a staff for her, a butler, and a cook, and a coachman, at perhaps $30,000 a year. Set that beside a working man's wage of the time, and it is a fortune poured over one woman like water. He had cornered gold. He had bought a railroad and a regiment and an opera house. He believed, as men like him always believe, that a heart could be bought on the same terms as everything else. He was about to learn otherwise, and the lesson would be fatal. Because Jim Fisk, who had everything he ever hankered after, once said so himself. Money, he said, friends, stock, trade, credit, and the best horses in New England, and by God, a reputation. He had all of it. The one thing he lacked was her, and he had not yet understood that this was a thing no amount of the rest could fix. Chapter 4. The tunnel, the letters, and the friend who took her. Fisk built a covered passage from the back of his railroad office to the rear door of his mistress's house. And then, with the carelessness of a man who thinks he has bought a person outright, he introduced her to the one man who would use that house against him. The tunnel is worth pausing on, because it is the whole man in a single image. He had a mistress in a brownstone a few steps from his own headquarters, and rather than simply walk the street between them, he threw up a private covered way so that he could pass from the railroad to the woman and back again unseen. A secret architecture of desire built at a swindler's scale. Everything Fisk touched became a stage set. Even his adultery had a wing added on. The man he introduced to Josie was Edward Stokes, and Stokes was everything Fisk was not. Where Fisk was loud, up from nothing, hated by the respectable. Stokes was a handsome young man of good family, a Philadelphia and New York background, married to the daughter of a rich manufacturer, at ease in exactly the drawing rooms that would never quite open to Jim Fisk. The two men had gone into business together. Stokes ran an oil refinery in Brooklyn, and Fisk had become his silent partner. And the thing that made the partnership rich was Fisk's power to grant the refinery secret cut rates to ship its oil on the Erie line. So from the start, the bond between the two men was money and advantage, the exact sort of bond that turns to poison when the advantage sours. For Stokes, the refinery was the ground he stood on, and Fisk held it up with a single prop, the secret rate that let its oil ride cheap on the Erie line. Pull the prop away, and the whole business sagged into nothing. So when the two men turned on each other, Fisk found himself holding something far more dangerous than a grudge. He had the power to ruin Stokes outright, and Stokes understood that to the letter, and the understanding rotted in him through every month of the quarrel. Here was a young man of good family, raised to believe the drawing rooms of the city owed him their welcome, forced to watch a loud upstart from a Vermont peddler's wagon hold the deed to his fortune and the heart of his mistress in the same broad hand. Pride of that kind does not bargain. It waits, and it counts its injuries, and it goes looking for a reckoning, and it soured over a woman. Fisk introduced Stokes to Josie around the turn of the year in 1870, and the young man and the kept mistress fell in love with each other. In the January of that year, Josie wrote to Fisk and ended it. Fisk's reply has the rueful wit of a man who has been outmaneuvered and half knows it. "You cannot," he wrote, "run two engines on one track in contrary directions at the same time." Stokes, for his part, declared himself plainly. He loved her, he said, and she loved him. Now the two quarrels, the money and the woman, braided together into a single war, and it was fought in the only arena Fisk truly understood, which was combat. In the January of 1871, Fisk had Stokes arrested for embezzling from the refinery, and he seized the refinery itself by force. The charge collapsed. Stokes was awarded a sum in compensation that he considered an insult, around $10,000 against a stake he valued at far more, and he came away from it enraged rather than chastened, a proud man, publicly robbed by a vulgar one, and stripped of the woman too. Stokes then had Fisk arrested for false imprisonment. Fisk sued to recover his property and his letters. The courts of New York became the ground on which the three of them tore at one another. The fight in the courts was its own kind of theatre, and Fisk waged it the way he waged everything, loudly and without a trace of shame. He had Stokes hauled in on one charge. Stokes had him hauled in on another. Affidavits flew. A former servant was found to swear he had overheard the pair plotting extortion, and the newspapers printed every word of it, delighted, because a millionaire and his mistress and her young lover clawing at one another in open court was better than anything playing on the stage beneath his office. But under the spectacle, the stakes were real, and they were closing. Fisk had the money and the lawyers and the machine of the whole city behind him, and week by week the law leaned his way. The injunction against the letters held. The blackmail charge moved forward. And Edward Stokes, who had begun the year a rich young man of good family, could see the shape of where it ended, in a courtroom, ruined and disgraced, with Josie's letters sealed and worthless in a clerk's drawer, and his own name a byword. A proud man can bear ruin. What he cannot always bear is ruin at the hands of a man he holds beneath him. And here the recurring thing enters the story, the object that will run through all three of these killings and change its meaning as it goes. The letter. Josie held a great bundle of Fisk's love letters, and she and Stokes let it be understood that the letters contained more than love, that folded among the endearments were admissions of Fisk's business crimes, and that for the right sum the bundle could be made to disappear. The sum named in one account was $25,000, in another $40,000. Fisk, who had bought so much, refused to buy this. He called it what it was, which was blackmail, and he went to law, winning an injunction against the letters being published and pressing to have Stokes indicted for extortion, while Josie in turn sued him for libel and made Stokes her chief witness. Look again at what those letters were, and what they had become. They had begun as the private words of a man in love, the one place where Jim Fisk, cornerer of gold, colonel of nothing, was simply a man writing to a woman. Now they were a weapon held to his throat, a lever to pry money out of him, an exhibit in 3 lawsuits. The tokens of the courtship had become the instruments of the war, and they were not finished changing yet. By the first days of January in 1872, the law was grinding steadily in Fisk's favour. On the morning of January 6th, a grand jury was moving to advance the blackmail case against Stokes, and the libel suit was proceeding with Stokes exposed as Josie's witness. For Stokes, it was the closing of a trap. He was ruined in money, beaten in court, robbed as he saw it of both the refinery and the woman, and now facing indictment and public disgrace. He left the courthouse that afternoon, a cornered man. What a cornered man of the Gilded Age did next, Lafayette Square had already shown. He found a pistol. Chapter 5. A body on the hotel stairs. On the same morning, a grand jury moved against him for blackmail. Edward Stokes left the courthouse, learned that the day had gone against him, and by the late afternoon he was climbing the private stair of the grandest hotel in the city with a small revolver in his coat. The Grand Central Hotel stood on Broadway, one of the largest hotels in America, a palace of a place. Fisk came to it that afternoon on an ordinary errand, mounting the staircase of the ladies' entrance, and Stokes was there at the top, descending as Fisk climbed. This time there were no words at all. Fisk climbed, Stokes descended to meet him, and Stokes fired twice. One ball struck Fisk in the arm, the other went into his abdomen. Stokes let the pistol fall onto a sofa and turned to flee, and the hotel staff seized him before he reached the door. They carried Jim Fisk up to a room, and there the showman began the slowest and least theatrical performance of his life, which was his dying. The surgeons probed the wound in his belly, searching for the ball, and found nothing they could reach, and told him what they had found, which was that the wound was in all likelihood mortal. He lingered through the night. Jay Gould, his partner in the Gold Corner, is said to have stood at his bedside. So is Boss Tweed, the ruler of the city's machine. And to the police captain and the coroner, who came to take his word while there was still time to take it, Fisk named his killer plainly. He had seen, he said, that Stokes had something in his hand, and then he had seen the flash and heard the report and felt the ball go into him, and he identified Edward Stokes as the man who shot him. When they brought Stokes before the dying man to be sure, Fisk knew him and said nothing to him at all. Stokes, asked to account for himself, gave the only answer he would give for a long time: "I will answer nothing." Jim Fisk died the next morning, the 7th of January, 1872, at 11:15, 36 years old. And then the city did the strangest thing, the thing that reveals what he had truly been. It mourned him like a king. His body was carried to his own grand opera house and laid in state upon the stage. And here is the image to keep, because it is the whole of him. They dressed him for the last performance in the gilded uniform of his honorary colonelcy, waxed his moustache, drew white gloves onto his folded hands, and opened the doors. Something like 20,000 people filed past him. His regiment escorted the coffin. A great band played a dead march down Broadway. A funeral train bore him north to the Vermont town he had come from, and it arrived near midnight, and nearly the whole town, some 5,000 souls, stood in the January dark to meet it. A rogue, a swindler, a man who had ruined others and grinned about it, buried with the honors of a fallen hero, because the poor he had been kind to did not care what the rich thought of him. They raised a great marble monument over him in the Vermont hills, 4 stone women at its corners for his railroad and his steamships, and his stage and his money, cut by the same hand that carved the tomb of Abraham Lincoln. A ballad went round the streets in the years after, a tear-stained thing that named him the friend who never went back on the poor and raged that his killer had cheated the rope. And there is a last small strangeness to leave the showman on. More than a century after they laid him in the ground, some unknown hand pried his carved portrait clean off the face of that monument and carried it away, so that the 4 stone women now keep their watch over a blank oval where the face of Jim Fisk used to be. The man who staged everything, even his own dying, ended as a shape robbed out of his own stone. And the letters that had begun as love and become blackmail and then a murder's cause, changed their meaning one last time. About a week after his death, a New York paper printed 39 of them. The city leaned in to read the business secrets a man had died to protect. There were none. They were, in the paper's own phrase, commonplace communications between a man and the woman he loved, full of tenderness and jealousy and nothing else at all. The bundle that Josie and Stokes had brandished as a loaded gun had been empty the whole time. Jim Fisk had gone to his death over the threat of a secret that did not exist. Now, the price. Edward Stokes was tried 3 times over. The first jury could not agree, and there were whispers of bribery around it. The second convicted him of murder in the first degree and sentenced him to hang, and the sentence came down on the 6th of January, 1 year to the day after the shooting. He sat in the condemned cells and waited for the rope. And then the higher court reversed the conviction, ruling that the trial judge had wrongly told the jury where the burden of proof lay and ordered him tried again. The third jury, hearing new testimony that Fisk himself had gone armed, that he had kept pistols and even had special pockets sewn to carry them, came back with manslaughter. The sentence was 4 years. 4 years. That is what the killing of Jim Fisk cost the man who did it. He served his time, much of it in comfort that scandalized the newspapers, meals sent in, a carpet on his cell floor. And he came out and grew rich again as a partner in a fashionable hotel, and he lived on to 1901. His obituary called him a haunted man, paranoid to the last, suing everyone, afraid of everything. A man who had walked out of the shadow of the rope and never truly walked out of the shadow of the stair. So here already is the pattern from Lafayette Square, running for the first time. A body on the floor, and a killer who did not hang. And the woman, Josie Mansfield, the beauty in the $250,000 of emeralds. She sued the estate for $200,000 and lost. The first hotels refused her a room. She was hooted in the streets. She fled to Paris and drifted for the rest of a long life under borrowed names, through Boston and Philadelphia, and a town on the far plains, married and divorced a man who ended in an asylum, was falsely reported dead more than 40 years before she actually died, and at last, on an October day in 1931, collapsed in a Paris shop and died in a foreign hospital at 83, buried with 2 servants and a single friend to see her go. She outlived the man who was killed over her by nearly 60 years, and she spent almost every one of them being slowly erased. Stokes at least served his 4 years. It is the harshest sentence any killer in this film will receive, and it is the only one, because the next killer would fire in front of a man's own wife and children, on the open deck of a ferry, in the plain sight of a crowd, and would not spend a single year in a prison for it. Who killed and who walked? Watch the answer get worse. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Buried 4 Husbands. By the time Laura Fair met the man she would kill, she had already married 4 times over, and buried or divorced every one of them. She had been born in Mississippi in the summer of 1837, and she went west as a young woman, as so many did, chasing the silver and the gold. By the early 1860s, she was running a boarding house in the raw, booming town of Virginia City, in the Nevada silver country. A woman keeping her own establishment and investing in her own mines, in a place where fortunes came out of the ground overnight and vanished as fast. She had real gifts. She could act, and she took the stage in Sacramento as Lady Teasle in an old comedy of scandal, which is the sort of irony the age handed out for free. And she had beauty. One reporter, watching her years later in a courtroom, described bright golden hair and blue eyes and an expression, he wrote, of great sadness and weariness and passive suffering. Another visitor, seeing how she lived at the height of her fame, wrote that she was named at dinner tables as a duchess might be named in the finest quarter of London. She had made her own way in a country that gave women almost no way to make one. In the silver towns, she kept her own house and put her own money into the ground, in a world where by law a married woman's wages and her property passed to her husband the moment she wed. That independence is part of what the respectable classes could never forgive in her. A woman who answered to no man, who had made herself and could unmake a marriage, in an age that had built its whole order on the opposite arrangement. Long before the killing, It made her a figure a great many people were quietly ready to see hang. But look back over the marriages, because they are the shadow the beauty cast. The papers summed her up in 4 words: twice widowed, twice divorced. The first husband she married at 16, and he was dead within about a year, of causes one historian could only call mysterious. A second marriage in New Orleans she ended in a matter of months. The third husband was a lawyer some 15 years older than she was, and his end is the one that matters, because in December of 1861 he took a gun and shot himself. She kept his name for the rest of her life. Fair. And there was a fourth. A brief marriage entered and dissolved in the autumn of 1870, in the very weeks before the killing, as though she were clearing the ground of a husband before she went to the ferry. So watch the gun move through her story, quietly, long before she ever raised one. A husband dead by his own pistol in 1861. A lover shot down by her hand 9 years later. And far off at the other end of her life, an old woman with a razor at her own throat. The instrument of death runs through Laura Fair from beginning to end like a thread pulled taut, and every knot in it is a person she loved. Here the pattern from Lafayette Square turns on its head, and the turn matters, because it is the one great variation in this film. In the story of Jim Fisk, and in the story to come, the killer is a man, and the destroyed party is a woman. In this one story, the hand on the pistol is a woman's. Laura Fair is the exception that proves how the machine really worked, because when a woman killed for love, the same forces that freed the men, the unwritten law, the plea of a mind unhinged, the newspapers, closed around her differently. They twisted into a shape stranger and more revealing than anything the men were ever offered. They freed her by declaring that her whole sex was a kind of madness. But that is the second trial, and to reach it, the story has to cross the bay. The man she loved was Alexander Parker Crittenden, and he was, on paper, the most respectable figure in any of these stories. He came from a famous political family in Kentucky, a nephew of a United States Attorney General. He had gone to West Point. He had come to San Francisco in the early 1850s and risen to the top of its bar, a leading attorney, a former legislator, a man of standing with a wife named Clara and a house full of children. He was in his late 40s when the affair began, more than 20 years older than Laura, and he told her, when it began, a lie so ordinary and so fatal that it sits at the center of the whole tragedy. He told her he was not a married man. He was no small-time seducer, and that matters, because his standing is what made the betrayal survivable for him and lethal for her. Alexander Crittenden had a wife named Clara and a house full of children, some of whom would be sitting at his side on the ferry the evening he died. He was a former legislator, a founder of a law firm, a man received in every respectable house in San Francisco. For the better part of 7 years, he kept a second life with Laura Fair, a few streets from his first, promising in the one house to leave the other, and keeping neither promise, because a man of his weight could afford to keep a mistress waiting forever and pay nothing for it. The law gave her no claim on him, no standing, no redress. He had given her only his word, and his word, it turned out, was the cheapest thing he owned. Chapter 7. 7 years and a wife on the ferry. For 7 years, Alexander Crittenden promised to leave his wife and marry Laura Fair, and for 7 years he did not. The affair had begun around 1863, when he took rooms at her boarding house, and it ran on for the better part of a decade. In her own testimony, she called it 7 years of intimacy, and in those 7 years the promise was made and broken and made again so many times that the shape of it became the shape of her life. He would leave Clara. He would not leave Clara. He would marry Laura. He did not marry Laura. She married another man briefly in that final autumn and divorced him within weeks, and still the pull of Crittenden held. 7 years is a long time to be promised a future. For all of them, a man dangled the one thing he had sworn to give and never once delivered it. And the law of the day gave a wronged mistress precisely nothing, no claim, no standing, no redress. All she had was the promise, repeated and repeated until it had worn a groove in her. There is a cruelty peculiar to a promise endlessly renewed and endlessly broken, worse in its way than a plain refusal, because it never lets the hope die and never lets it be kept. For 7 years, Laura Fair lived inside that cruelty. She was past 30, a woman of property and reputation who had run her own house and buried and shed husbands before, and she had bound her whole future to a lawyer who would not say the word that would free her, and would not say the word that would release her either. He kept her in the doorway between mistress and wife, and he kept her there the better part of a decade, and when at last it seemed the door might swing open, he closed it in the plainest way a man can, by going down to the water to bring his wife home. Whatever the jury would later be told about tides and madness, that much was simply true. She had given a man 7 years, and he had handed her back a bag of promises and a berth on the boat where she would kill him. Then, in September of 1870, Crittenden sent Clara and the children east, away from San Francisco, and Laura appears to have believed at last that the marriage was ending, that the long promise was finally about to be kept. It was the cruelest reading she could have made. Crittenden had sent his family east for a season, and now they were coming home, and he had gone down to the boat to meet them, to gather his wife back to him, to be a husband again. And Laura learned of it. For Laura, it was the collapse of the one belief that had held her steady through 7 years, that the waiting would end at last in a wedding. She had turned her whole life on that promise. She had refused to be only a mistress, had married and unmarried another man in the very weeks around it, as though clearing the ground. And now the man who had sworn 100 times to make her his wife was on the water, gathering back into his arms the wife he already had. Something in her, the defense would later say, gave way in that hour. Something colder had perhaps been ready in her for a long time. Both of those things may be true at once. What follows is the single image this segment is built around. Picture it exactly. The evening of the 3rd of November, 1870. A ferry crossing the darkening water of San Francisco Bay. On its deck sat Alexander Crittenden, reunited with Clara, 3 of his children around him, a family knitting itself back together as the lights of the city came up across the water. And moving toward them through the other passengers came a woman dressed entirely in black, her face hidden behind a heavy veil. She had a small pistol with 4 short barrels concealed in her clothing. She came up to the seated man, and she drew it, and she fired 1 shot into his chest at the range of a step. There is a terrible doubleness in that veil, and it is why the veil is the object at the heart of her story. A veil of black was the uniform of mourning, and Laura Fair had worn mourning before, a serial widow already dressed for grief. But the prosecution would argue that this veil was something colder, a disguise she had brought aboard on purpose to hide her face until the moment came. Grief and calculation sewn into the same square of black cloth, and no one able to see which lay behind it. That was the point of a veil. No one could read the face beneath. Crittenden's son gave chase. A harbour policeman on the boat ran her down and took the pistol and held her in the wheelhouse, and there, in custody, the composed, veiled figure began to come apart. Handed a glass of water to steady her, she bit a piece clean out of the rim of the glass, It is a small, real, frightening detail, a mind starting to splinter in the first minutes after the act, and the defense would build a great deal upon it. Alexander Crittenden did not die at once. He was carried home, and he lingered 2 days, and he died at 6 in the evening on the 5th of November, 54 years old. His funeral was among the largest the city had ever seen, and the courts of San Francisco adjourned in his honor, which shows precisely where the weight of the establishment would sit when it came time to try the woman who killed him. And what of her own words, in the moment the veil came off? They come down in several nearly matching forms, and they are not the words of someone hiding from what she had done. She said that she had done it, and that she did not deny it, that he had ruined her and her child, and that she had meant to kill him. No plea in that first raw moment of a mind gone dark. That plea would be assembled later, in a courtroom, out of medical theories and the desperate arithmetic of a defense trying to keep a client off the gallows. In the wheelhouse, with the glass bleeding splinters from her mouth, Laura Fair said simply that she had meant to do it. Set against that confession, the words the dead man had written her while he lived, because the record kept his letters, and they are unbearable now. "My love for you," he had written, "has been and is the one passion of my life. It is my whole life, and it will never cease but with death." He had promised her his whole life and given her 7 years of delay. He had written that it would end only with death, and he had been right about that, though not in the way he meant. His letters, like Fisk's letters, were tokens of love that curdled into evidence. Everything written in tenderness in these stories comes back, in the end, as an exhibit. Chapter 8. The madness that set her free. The state of California sentenced Laura Fair to hang, and then a theory about a woman's body walked her out from under the rope. Her first trial came in the spring of 1871, and it did not go well for her. The prosecutor painted a jealous, scheming woman who had bought a pistol days before, made threats, and carried a veil aboard as a mask. The jury was out for something like 40 minutes. It came back with murder in the first degree. She was sentenced to hang, and a date was set in the summer of that year. She is widely described as the first white woman ever sentenced to death in California, a claim that comes down the way legends do, repeated everywhere and confirmed nowhere. Better treated as the era's boast than as a settled fact. Either way, a woman sat in a California cell waiting for a rope, for the killing of a man the city had buried as a pillar of itself. And then the defense went to work on the second act, and the argument it made is one of the strangest and most telling in the whole history of American crime. It argued that Laura Fair had not been sane when she fired, not sane in a new and specifically female way. It argued emotional insanity, the fashionable descendant of the plea that had freed Daniel Sickles, and it reached further, into the medicine of the body. A doctor testified that a disorder of her monthly cycle had thrown her, again and again, into fits of temporary madness, that a woman in her condition was biologically unable to govern her own feelings. It was as strange a theory as any American courtroom had entertained, and it was argued in deadly earnest by physicians of standing. The court was asked to believe that a woman's body, at its regular seasons, could tip her whole mind into a passing madness. That reason itself ran in her on a monthly tide she had no power to command. 7 years of Crittenden's betrayal had cracked the foundation, the argument ran, and her own womanhood had done the rest, so that she could no more answer for the shot on the ferry than a sleepwalker could answer for the road walked in the dark. It saved her from the rope. It did so by telling the court and the country that a woman was a creature of fits and tides who could not finally be trusted to be sane, which was the very belief that kept every woman in the land out of the jury box, out of the ballot, out of the professions. The plea that opened her cell was cut from the same cloth as the cage that held her whole sex. The California Supreme Court set aside the conviction and ordered a new trial. And at that second trial, in 1872, the jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity. She walked out of the court a free woman, sit with what freed her. The men in these stories are excused by a moment of noble rage, a brief madness born of wounded honor. Laura Fair was excused by the claim that she was mad more or less by nature, that her sex was a standing condition of unreason, that a woman could not be held to account because a woman could not be trusted to be sane in the first place. It saved her life. It also handed the Age exactly the argument it used to keep women out of every room where decisions were made. And that trap was seen at the time, clearly, by the women best placed to see it. For this case became a battlefield of the suffrage movement. Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to visit Laura in her cell. Anthony defended her from a lecture platform in San Francisco, and the hall hissed her, and the papers turned on her so savagely that she cut short her speaking dates in the city. A line has come down from that lecture, carried by her later biographers in various wordings, that if all men had protected all women as they would wish their own wives and daughters protected, there would be no Laura Fair in the jail that night. Whether Anthony spoke those exact words is impossible to confirm, and it would be wrong to set them down as fact. But the sentiment was hers, and it cost her dearly to say it. Other suffragists recoiled, and they had good reason. They saw that a defense built on female irrationality was the very poison being used against their cause, that to save this one woman by calling her sex a madness was to arm the enemy. One of Laura's defenders, a suffragist named Emily Pitts Stevens, cut to the true shape of it, calling Crittenden a notorious rake and an adulterer, and Laura a poor, wretched, friendless woman. That was the argument the movement wanted, the double standard named out loud. But it was the other argument, the madness of the womb, that opened the cell door. She did not have a soft life after. She tried to turn her fame into money with a lecture she called Wolves in the Fold, and the first time she rose to give it a mob of some 2,000 people gathered in the street and shut it down, and she finally delivered it far from San Francisco, bitter and unbowed, attacking the press and the clergy and the jury that had first tried her. She became, in her defiance, half legend, cited as the model for a murderess in the novel by Mark Twain that gave the whole era its name, and the gun kept its hold on her to the last. Long after, when her own daughter died, Laura Fair took a razor to her own throat and survived even that, and died at last in 1919, past 80, and was lowered into an unmarked grave. So the machine had run a second time, and the answer had gotten worse. Stokes killed a fellow rogue in a hot quarrel and served 4 years. Laura Fair executed the man who had wronged her, coldly, in the open, in front of his wife and his children, and served nothing at all, freed by a theory that insulted every woman in the country in order to save one. But she had at least killed the man who wronged her. The last of the 3 killers wronged no one who could be found, and murdered someone who had never done him the smallest harm. He aimed his hatred at a rival across a clubroom, and he killed a stranger, an old woman with a headache who had never heard his name, and he too, in the end, walked free. Chapter 9. The Chemist, the Singer, and the Rival Who Died First. Roland Molineux had a private laboratory, a father who was a war hero, and a rival for the woman he wanted, and within a single year, the rival was dead. The Molineux name meant something in Brooklyn. His father was General Edward Leslie Molineux, a genuinely decorated Civil War officer, badly wounded leading his men, a pillar of the city's respectable society, the sort of old soldier whose word was a kind of currency. That standing is what made the case a national sensation. The accused was the son of a hero, raised in comfort, welcomed everywhere, and the horror the country felt was the horror of watching that good name walk into a courtroom on a charge of secret poisoning. Roland himself was a chemist, and a good one, superintendent of the colour works at a large dye manufacturer, a man who kept a private laboratory and a chemist's library, and who had, at his fingertips, mercury and arsenic, and the ingredients from which a patient hand could build cyanide of mercury, one of the swiftest poisons known. He was also an athlete, a gymnast of some local fame, and a member of a fashionable gentlemen's club called the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, where much of this story would unfold. He was proud, and he was vain, and he did not take loss well, and the record of what he did suggests a man for whom every slight was a wound that had to be answered. That pride is the thread to keep hold of. The club world he moved in was a small and watchful kingdom of gentlemen, all ranks and slights and honours, and Roland Molineux cared about his standing in it the way other men cared about their fortunes. A humiliation there was no trifle to him. It was the kind of wound that a certain sort of man will carry for a year and repay with interest, and never once think himself the villain of the thing. His father had a hero's name. His laboratory held the means to build a poison that no eye would see coming, and his heart held a grudge that had no bottom to it. It was a dangerous set of gifts to gather in a single man. The woman was Blanche Chesebra, an aspiring singer, and Molineux met her in the summer of 1897 and set about courting her. He proposed. She turned him down that winter. And the reason the proposal failed is the engine of the whole tragedy, because Molineux had made the same careless mistake Jim Fisk once made. He had introduced the woman he wanted to another man. That man was Henry Barnett, a stockbroker and a fellow member of the same club, and Blanche found herself drawn to Barnett. Two men of the same set, the same rooms, the same circle, both wanting the same woman, and the woman inclining toward the rival rather than toward Roland Molineux. Blanche is the quietest figure in this story, and the hardest to read. A young woman with a voice she hoped to make a career of, caught between two men of the same club who both wanted her. By the accounts that survive, she leaned toward Barnett, and she is said to have told Roland Molineux plainly, when he pressed his suit a second time, that it was Barnett she loved. For a man who did not take loss well, there could have been no sharper wound to be refused for a friend he had brought into her life himself, a man he passed in the same club rooms every week of the year. The record keeps her own feelings mostly to itself. It is far clearer about what became of the man she chose. It is the oldest shape in this film, the shape from the hotel stair and the shape from the ferry, and it resolved itself here with a quiet horror the other two never approached. Because Henry Barnett did not live to marry anyone. In the autumn of 1898, Barnett fell violently ill. He had received in the mail a sample of a patent medicine, an effervescent powder of the kind men dosed themselves with for a sour stomach, and he had taken it, and he sickened, and on the 10th of November, 1898, he died. The cause was set down at the time as a complication of diphtheria, a failure of the heart. The rival was simply gone, carried off by disease, and the field was clear. For a moment it looked like nothing worse than the ordinary bad luck of the age, a young man carried off by an infection in a city where infection carried off the young every winter. And into that clear field stepped Roland Molineux. The man who had lost the woman now had her, in the very week the rival was buried, and the speed of it should have been the loudest thing in the room. But grief and haste are not proof, and a death by sickness closes no doors and asks no questions. And so for a while, The whole thing lay quiet, a marriage begun over a fresh grave, and no one moved to disturb it. 19 days later, Roland Molineux married Blanche Chesebra. Hold those two dates against each other, because a prosecutor one day would hold them up before a jury and let them do their silent work. Barnet dead on the 10th of November. Molineux married on the 29th. 19 days between the funeral of the rival and the wedding of the man who had lost the woman to him. At the time, no one moved. It was a death by illness and a marriage by choice, and the two seemed to belong to different worlds. But some months later, when the second and far more public killing had forced the question open, they took Henry Barnet out of the ground. They examined what was left of him, and in his remains they found cyanide of mercury, the same poison, the same rare and deliberate poison that had by then killed a woman across the city. The truth was uglier than the death certificate. Barnet had been murdered, quietly, by mail, and it had passed for a sickness for months. And here is the strangest turn of the law in this whole film, the turn everything else will hinge on. For the killing of Henry Barnet, Roland Molineux was never charged, never indicted, never tried. The poisoning that cleared his path to Blanche stood there in the record, exhumed and proven, and the law would find it could not use it. Keep that in mind. The death that revealed everything about the man was the very death the courts would order the jury to forget. Chapter 10. A gift wrapped in Tiffany-blue. The parcel that came to the club looked like a present from a secret admirer, a silver holder and a pretty blue bottle. And it was meant for the one man Roland Molineux hated more than any other. That man was Harry Cornish, the athletic director of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, and the hatred between the two of them had been building for years. It had started small, the way these things do, in the friction of club life. A dispute over an amateur entertainment Molineux had organised, an athletic contest, a matter of who outranked whom in the little kingdom of the gymnasium. Cornish was a blunt, popular professional, and he had wounded Molineux's vanity more than once, and he was said to have spread a coarse insult about him, calling him a third-rate athlete who kept low company. Molineux had gone to the club's board and demanded that they choose between the two of them, him or Cornish, the gentleman member or the hired athletic man. The board kept Cornish, and Molineux had resigned in fury, loudly professing his hatred as he went. A full year later, that hatred arrived at Harry Cornish's door in a small box. The grudge had a long fuse. It had smouldered through a whole year of Molineux's exile from the club, a year in which he nursed the memory of a board that had chosen a hired athletic man over a gentleman of his name. And when it came at last, it came dressed as kindness, which is the true signature of the whole crime, a thing of pure malice folded into the manners of a gift. Everything about the parcel was built to disarm. The famous blue of the box promised a jewel. The silver holder promised taste and expense. Only the powder inside promised anything else, and the powder was the one thing no one would think to fear until it was far too late. Just before Christmas of 1898, a package reached Cornish at the club. Inside was a box of that unmistakable pale robin's egg blue, the blue of the famous jeweller, and inside the box an ornate silver holder, and standing in the holder a blue glass bottle of a common headache remedy, a bromo salt that fizzed in water. There was a little card envelope, but no signature, no note, nothing to say who had sent it. It looked for all the world like a small anonymous gift, the kind a man might get from an admirer he could not place. And Cornish took it as one, and joked about it, and in the last days of the year he carried it home. Home was a boarding house he shared with his cousin and her mother, a widow named Katherine Adams, about 62 years old. a woman with no part in any of this, who had never stood in a gymnasium or crossed Roland Molineux in her life. On the morning of the 28th of December, 1898, Mrs. Adams had a headache. Here was a headache remedy close at hand. Cornish mixed her a dose from the pretty blue bottle, and she drank it. She was dead within minutes. She collapsed almost at once, in terrible distress, and a doctor who came caught it too late, and caught also the thing that told him what he was looking at, the faint, sweet smell of bitter almonds rising from the glass, the signature of cyanide. It had taken almost no time at all. She had risen with an ordinary complaint and reached for an ordinary remedy, the most domestic act imaginable, and she was dying before the glass had gone cool in her hand. Across the room, the man the poison had been built for stood sickened and shaken, alive by the narrow accident of a small dose and a taste too bitter to swallow. Watching an old woman he lodged with die on the floor over a quarrel she had never heard a single word of. The poison had been built and boxed and mailed for a strong young athletic director, an enemy in a grudge over club athletics. It killed a 62-year-old widow with a headache, a woman whose only connection to the whole affair was that she happened to keep house for the man it was meant for. That is the collapse of this entire story into a single object on a single table. A gift wrapped in the blue of the finest jeweler in America, a silver holder, a blue bottle, poured out with kindness for an old woman's ordinary pain, and carrying death for a man she was not even related to by blood. Everything gentle in the picture, the gift, the pretty box, the small domestic mercy of mixing a remedy for someone in pain, is turned by one unseen hand into murder. And the murder missed. The whole monstrous design, the poison a chemist could make, the anonymous parcel, the patient malice of a year, and it fell on the one person in the house who had done nothing at all. She was a widow, past 60, this Katherine Adams, keeping house with her daughter and her daughter's cousin, a woman whose whole life had narrowed to the small rounds of a boarding house on a quiet street. She had no fortune anyone wanted, no rival, no secret, no place at all in the war of vanity being waged in a gymnasium miles from her door. She was in the story for one reason only, that she happened to share a roof with the man a poisoner meant to kill, and happened, on the wrong morning, to have a headache. The elaborate machine of the crime, the chemistry and the false names and the year of patient hatred, all of it came to rest on the most innocent person it could possibly have found. Harry Cornish, the man it was built for, lived another day and would testify for years. Katherine Adams, who had done nothing, was dead inside a minute. That is the true arithmetic of the thing, and there is no way to make it balance. The card had no name on it. That absence, the unsigned gift, would become the thing the whole case turned on, because if the sender left no name in ink, he had left it, the investigators believed, in 100 other strokes of the pen. To find the man who sent the blue bottle, they went hunting a handwriting instead of a poison. Chapter 11. The handwriting, the rule, and the little door. They could not prove the poison in his hand, so they set out to prove it in his handwriting, and it very nearly killed him. The case against Roland Molineux was almost entirely circumstantial. No one had seen him buy the mercury, or mix the cyanide, or carry the parcel to the post. What the investigators had was paper. They found that in the months before the killings, private letterboxes had been rented in the city under the names of the two men at the centre of the affair. Boxes used to order samples of patent medicines through the mail, the exact channel by which a poisoned powder could be requested and received. Boxes in the names of the dead man and the intended victim, rented by a hand that was not theirs, and they had the writing itself. the address on the murderous parcel, the orders to the medicine companies, a whole trail of ink. To read that trail, they brought in handwriting experts, some 14 of them, men who spent their working lives telling a true signature from a forged one, and one after another, they matched the writing to Roland Molineux. There was even a small human giveaway that the men of the club seized on, a habit Molineux had of misspelling a common word, writing the number that comes after 39 with an extra letter in it, a tick that showed up in the incriminating papers like a thumbprint. The poison was faceless. The handwriting had a face, and the prosecution swore it was his. There was more than the letters. The paper itself gave him away, an unusual tinted stock marked with 3 crescents, and a woman who worked in Molineux's own colour factory swore she had seen that very paper in his desk. Order by order, box by box, the trail of ink ran from the poisoned parcel back toward the chemist's hand. It was all circumstantial. No one had watched the poison mixed or the parcel mailed. There was no confession, no witness, no cyanide found on him. But circumstance, stacked high enough and told well enough, can carry the whole weight of a rope. And for a time, it did exactly that. His first trial ran through the winter of 1899 into the new year, one of the longest and most costly trials the state had ever staged. And here the prosecution made the move that would echo through American law for more than a century. It told the jury about Henry Barnett. It laid the earlier, uncharged poisoning beside the later one, and let the jury see the pattern: 2 men in one man's way, both reached by poison through the mail, one dead outright and one dead by mistake in his place. The prosecutor stood before them and set the 2 dates side by side and let them ring. The defendant, he said, was married on the 29th of November. Barnett died on the 10th of November. He did not need to say the rest. The jury convicted Roland Molineux of murder in the 1st degree, and the court sentenced him to die in the electric chair. And they sent him up the river to the death house at Sing Sing, where he sat for more than 2 years, within a short walk of the room where the state meant to kill him. 2 years is a long time to wait for the electric chair. He wrote in that place and read, and watched other men led down the corridor to the room at the end of it, and he gave that corridor and that room a name that would outlast almost everything else he ever set on paper. The room with the little door. The little door was the one that opened onto the chair. He was, by every appearance, a dead man drawing out his own last chapter in a cell. And then the law reached down and pulled him back from it. Then the higher court reversed it all, and the reason is the reason lawyers still say his name today. The court ruled that the evidence of the Barnett killing should never have been put before the jury, because Molineux had never been charged with the Barnett killing, and a man on trial for one crime must be convicted, if he is convicted at all, on proof of that crime and no other. The judge who wrote the ruling put it in words that have outlived everyone in this story. The general rule, he wrote, is that when a man is put upon trial for one offence, he is to be convicted, if at all, by evidence which shows that he is guilty of that offence alone. It became known as the Molineux Rule, and it is still the law of New York, still argued in its courtrooms, still the reason a judge will hold a hearing over whether a jury may hear about a defendant's other bad acts. The killer's name lives on as a shield for every defendant who came after him. The man is forgotten. The rule is immortal. At the second trial, in the autumn of 1902, stripped of the Barnett death, the state's paper case looked far thinner, and the jury was out for about 13 minutes before it acquitted him. Roland Molineux walked free after nearly 3 years in the shadow of the chair. His freedom did him no good at all. His wife did not wait for him to enjoy it. Blanche filed for divorce within a week of the acquittal, and soon married the very lawyer who had handled her divorce. and she lived on quietly for decades and died in the 1950s. Molineux turned to writing. He wrote a book about his years in the death house, and he called it, with a terrible aptness, The Room with the Little Door. The little door being the one that opened onto the execution chamber. He wrote a play, and a famous producer staged it. And then, around the time of that small triumph, his mind began to go. He suffered a breakdown, and he was declared insane, and the son of the war hero, twice tried for the poison murder, was committed to a state asylum on Long Island, where he died in 1917, his reason eaten away by a disease that had been working in him for years. He had written of a little door onto the place where men were killed. He ended his life behind a different door, the door of the madhouse, which closed on him for good. 3 killers, 3 verdicts, and among all 3, not one rope, not one chair, not one life given for the lives that were taken. Stokes had at least served his 4 years. Laura Fair had at least killed the man who wronged her. Roland Molineux served nothing, and killed a woman who had wronged no one, and walked out into the street a free man. The wager had run its course. Now count the cost, and count who paid it. Chapter 12. Who paid the price of the marriage bed? Count the bodies in these stories, and then count who was ruined by them, and the two will never once be the same people. The killers walked. That is the plain arithmetic of it. Edward Stokes served 4 years and came out to grow rich in a hotel. Laura Fair served nothing and lived past 80. Roland Molineux served nothing and died a free man, however mad, in a state bed. Set beside that, the fates of the women who stood at the center of these triangles, and a pattern rises that is uglier than any single murder in the film. Josie Mansfield had worn $250,000 in emeralds. She had been the most talked of kept woman in New York, the face over which a titan of Wall Street was shot dead on a hotel stair. And she spent the next 59 years being slowly rubbed out. Refused rooms in the hotels that had once courted her custom, hooted in the streets, driven across an ocean, drifting through borrowed names and false reports of her own death. She died at last in a Paris hospital, an old woman almost no one remembered, and 3 people came to bury her. 59 years to travel from the emeralds to the empty grave. Weigh the distance in that. The money had been a costume, put on her by a man and taken off again by his death, and beneath it she had never owned a single thing the world could not strip away in an afternoon, least of all her own good name. She spent the second half of her life proving how little that had ever been worth. Laura Fair had been named at dinner tables like a duchess. She died in 1919 and went into an unmarked grave, her name cut nowhere at all. Blanche Chesebra had been sung about and fought over, a rival dead and a husband tried for his life over the wanting of her, and she survived by erasing herself, divorcing the ruin, and slipping away into an ordinary marriage and an ordinary quiet, which in this company counts as a kind of escape. To survive one of these stories, a woman had to disappear. That was the only door the age left standing open to her. She could be driven out like Josie, or buried nameless like Laura, or she could do the erasing herself before the world got to it, and slip into an ordinary marriage under an ordinary name, and count herself fortunate to be forgotten rather than destroyed. Freedom, for the men in these stories, meant walking back into their lives. Freedom, for the women, meant walking out of theirs and never being seen again. And behind all 3 of them, at the very head of the line, stands Teresa Sickles, who committed no crime at all, who was made to write out her own shame in her own hand, and who was cheered against and cast out and dead of consumption at about 30. while the husband who killed her lover lived to 94 and wore a medal. Line them up, the four of them, and the symmetry is unbearable. The one who was shot over, the one who did the shooting, the one who was married under the shadow of a poisoning, and the one whose only crime was a confession written at her husband's order. They had almost nothing in common but this, that each stood at the center of a killing done in the name of love, and each was destroyed by it, while the men who actually did the killing lived on, some of them for decades, some of them honored, all of them free. The bodies in these stories are men, the ruins are women, and the age had a name for what it did to the women, or rather it had 100 names: madness and scandal and disgrace and consumption and simple forgetting, and no name at all for the plain thing those names were dressed over, which was punishment, handed to the innocent party for a crime that someone else had committed. A lawyer in a Washington courtroom in 1859 had told a jury that they were there to fix the price of the marriage bed. He meant it as a flourish, a way of saying that a wife's honor was worth a man's life. But the phrase turned out to be the truest thing said in any of these trials, because the age went on fixing that price, case after case, decade after decade. It fixed it on a hotel stair, and on a ferry deck, and on a boarding house table. And every time the price was fixed, the same party settled the account. Not the man who fired, not the man who mailed the poison. The woman at the center, whether she was the one who pulled the trigger or the one it was pulled beside, paid in exile, in madness, in erasure, in an unmarked grave. The marriage bed was priced again and again, and the bill was always handed to a woman. Chapter 13. The verdict the era wanted. These were the system working exactly as the age had built it to work. The unwritten law and its courtroom disguise had done precisely what they were made to do. Temporary insanity, emotional insanity. The plea born in Lafayette Square took a jury's raw sympathy for a wronged lover and dressed it in the sober coat of medicine, so that 12 men could act on their feelings and call it a finding of fact. It freed a congressman. It freed a woman by declaring her sex a sickness. It hovered over the poisoner's trials as the natural next move should the evidence have run the other way. And it did not stop with these three. The argument that passion could seize a mind and void a killing echoed on through the courts of the country for decades after. A permanent loophole cut into the law of murder, available above all to those with the money to summon the doctors and the lawyers who could make it sing. The newspapers had done their part too, and it was not a small part. The same press that sold the killings as entertainment, that printed the confessions and drew the courtrooms and made a veiled woman on a ferry into a national character, was the engine that built the public sympathy the juries then delivered. A killing became a story became a sensation became a mood, and a mood in favor of the handsome defendant seeped into the jury box no matter what the judge instructed. Wealth bought the defense. The press built the crowd. And the crowd, in the end, is what acquits. By the close of the century, the machine had only grown louder. The cheap papers of the Sickles years had become the great illustrated dailies of the poison trials, waging their circulation wars over the bodies of the dead, sketching the accused in the dock and the victims in their coffins, wiring every tremor of testimony from one coast to the other before the ink was dry. A society killing was the finest product the press had ever discovered, and it sold the same story every time: the handsome defendant, the ruined love, the shadow of madness, and it taught 100,000 readers to grieve for the prisoner before a single juror had been sworn. The verdict was half written in the newspapers before the trial ever began. The men in the jury box only signed it, and the loophole did not close when these three walked free. The plea born in Lafayette Square went on being made in courtroom after courtroom, for decades into the new century, whenever a man of means killed in the name of a wounded heart, and could pay for the lawyers and the doctors to call it madness. It became a fixture of the American murder trial, a standing invitation to a jury to feel its way toward an acquittal, and it was answered again and again by the same sort of jury that had cheered Daniel Sickles out of the dock. The particular scandals faded from the front pages. The mechanism behind them did not. It had been built to let a certain kind of man kill and be forgiven, and it went on doing exactly that, long after the names of Stokes and Fair and Molineux had slipped out of the newspapers and down into the footnotes. And underneath all of it ran the eerie thread, the register the age reached for whenever it did not care to look straight at what it had allowed. It is everywhere in these stories, once one starts to see it. Edward Stokes, rich again and safe, described in his own obituary as a haunted man, jumping at shadows to the end of his days, as though the ghost he had made on the staircase had simply moved into the house with him. Roland Molineux, vanishing behind the door of an asylum, his mind gone, as if the poison he built had at last found its way back into the maker. The women who lived through these stories were haunted in a plainer way, hunted through their remaining years by the thing that had been decided about them in a courtroom, that they were mad, or fallen, or best not spoken of, a sentence no appeal could ever overturn, because no court had formally passed it. The age loved its seances and its haunted houses and its curses because they let it feel a dread it could not otherwise name, the dread of a society that had quietly agreed to let its powerful kill for love and go home to supper. The ghost is the shape that guilt takes when a culture will not say the guilt aloud. And in every one of these houses, the thing doing the haunting was never a spirit. It was a verdict. Chapter 14. 3 bodies, and no one hanged. Return, at the end, to the staircase of the Grand Central Hotel, and to the showman dying in his gilded coat, because the whole of it is already there. Jim Fisk lay in state on the stage of his own opera house, dressed for the last performance in the uniform of a colonel he never truly was, white gloves on his folded hands, and 20,000 people filed past him in the winter of 1872. And if you had stood among them, shuffling past the coffin in the gaslight, you would have been looking, without knowing it, at the luckiest of the 3 victims in this film. Because Fisk was the only one whose killer would spend a single day behind a wall. Edward Stokes served his 4 years. After Stokes, the killers walked out of the courtroom and did not look back. History remembers these as crimes of passion. They were crimes of impunity, and the passion was only the alibi. Look at what the 3 killings actually shared, once the romance is stripped away. They shared a love that had gone to ruin, yes. But more than that, they shared an age that had decided, in advance and without ever writing it down, who would be allowed to kill and be forgiven. A man of means could shoot his rival on a public stair and serve 4 soft years. A woman could be walked out from under the rope by a theory that libeled every woman alive. A chemist could murder a stranger through the mail and be freed in the time it takes to boil an egg, and take with him into the madhouse a rule of law that would shield every killer who came after. The passion made the headlines. The impunity made the verdicts. A body on a staircase, a body on a ferry, a body on a boarding house floor, the wrong body, an old woman with a headache, 3 love triangles, and 3 killings, and 3 killers who did not hang, and beside each of them a woman rubbed slowly out of the world, from the emeralds to the empty grave, from the dinner tables to the unmarked plot, from the confession in her own hand to the consumption that took her at 30. The men fired and were forgiven. The women paid and were forgotten. It was true on the staircase, where a swindler died in a colonel's coat, and the man who shot him served 4 soft years and grew rich again in a hotel. It was true on the ferry, where a betrayed woman fired a single shot in the sight of a wife and children and walked out of the courtroom on a theory that shamed every woman alive. It was true on the boarding house floor, where a chemist's malice missed its mark and killed a stranger, and cost him nothing in the end but a rule of law and the door of a madhouse. 3 times the age was asked to set a life against a love. 3 times it freed the one who had done the killing. 3 times it handed the bill to a woman. And the age told itself a flattering story about all of it. It called these killings crimes of passion, and the phrase did a great deal of quiet work, because passion is a kind of weather, a thing that happens to a person, a storm no one can be blamed for. To call a killing a crime of passion is to half forgive it in the naming. Yet look again at what these 3 men and this one woman actually did. Stokes left a courthouse where the day had gone against him, found a gun, and waited on a staircase. Molineux spent a year at it, renting boxes under false names, building a poison in his laboratory, wrapping it as a gift. Even Laura Fair, whose grief was the realest of the 3, carried her pistol aboard the ferry behind a veil. There was passion in all of it, the true ruin of true love. But passion was the thing shown to the jury. Impunity was the thing the age was actually protecting. A lawyer once stood in a Washington courtroom and told 12 men they had gathered to fix the price of the marriage bed. He never guessed how right he was. He had meant it as a lawyer's flourish, a way of pricing a wife's honor for a jury of husbands. But the century took him at his word and went on pricing it, on a hotel staircase and a ferry deck and a boarding house floor. And the strange arithmetic never once changed. The killer set the price. The woman paid it. And the account, in every case, was marked settled. The price was fixed, again and again, across half a century of American scandal, and it was always paid in full, and it was never once paid by the hand that did the killing. So ask it one last time, the question the whole Gilded Century kept answering wrong: who killed and who walked? The killers are on the floor of the record, named and known, every one of them. And every one of them walked. It is the women, the ones who fired nothing and mailed nothing and did nothing at all, whom the story finally buried. If a story like this stays with you, then stay with me and subscribe, and I will keep bringing you the scandals the great families paid to bury. And before you go, tell me one thing. Of the 3 killers, every one of them freed, which verdict do you find hardest to forgive and why? I read every answer.